Dismantling Historical Postmodernism, a Realist Defense of the Past. The investigation into the historical Jesus, especially the verification of his death and resurrection, is grounded in the presupposition that the past is ultimately knowable. In contemporary historiography, this assumption has been vigorously challenged by proponents of historical postmodernism. Postmodern theorists contend that since the past cannot be directly observed, any effort to reconstruct historical events is inevitably shaped by the historian's subjectivity, thereby reducing history to either literary fiction or ideological propaganda. Such epistemological skepticism poses a significant challenge to both historical apologetics and biblical theology. If the past is fundamentally inaccessible, the historical foundations of the Christian faith become unattainable, leaving faith without a concrete anchor in space-time reality. This essay contends that critical realism represents the only viable and intellectually rigorous approach for recovering historical knowledge in response to postmodern skepticism. Drawing on the methodological frameworks outlined in Part 1, Chapter 3 of Gary R. Habermas's book On the Resurrection, Volume 1. Evidences. The central thesis advanced here is that the radical skepticism of historical postmodernism is self-refuting and ultimately undermines both scholarly and theological inquiry. In contrast, critical realism maintains the possibility of accessing a knowable historical past. To substantiate this thesis, the essay will analyze the idealist origins of postmodern skepticism, demonstrate the self-refuting character of radical historical relativism, and advocate for critical realism as the prevailing and valid model for contemporary historical research. Additionally, this essay will demonstrate that critical realist epistemology is not merely an academic preference, but a theological necessity. Within the framework of biblical theology, particularly Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan theology, history serves as the essential context for divine revelation. God's redemptive purposes unfold progressively through actual linear historical events, culminating in the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. By utilizing Habermas's Minimal Facts Method, historians can circumvent modern skeptical biases, thereby establishing a historical core acknowledged across ideological perspectives and affirming the space-time reality of the resurrection. The postmodern assault on the past, epistemological and historiographical critiques. Historical postmodernism did not arise independently. Rather, it represents an intensification of earlier 20th century idealist philosophies of history. Figures such as Wilhelm Dilthey, Benedetto Croce, and R.G. Collingwood sought to move historiography away from the rigid empirical positivism of the 19th century. Croce asserted that all history is the reenactment of past thought in the historian's own mind, highlighting the inevitable influence of the historian's present consciousness on the perception of the past. Collingwood similarly maintained that historians must reconstruct the internal motivations of historical actors, rather than simply cataloging external data. Although these idealists did not entirely abandon the pursuit of historical truth, they introduced a level of subjectivity that later postmodernists would amplify. The central postmodern critique of traditional objectivist historiography concerns unmediated access to the past. Postmodernists argue that because direct observation, reenactment, or empirical witnessing of past events is impossible, it is fundamentally unfeasible to prove what actually occurred. According to this perspective, the past is entirely separate from the present and lacks ontological status in current experience. The raw data of history, such as artifacts, inscriptions, and ancient manuscripts, are viewed as disconnected fragments. The coherence of these events is attributed not to the objective reality of the past, but to the subjective interpretations, narratives, and meta-narratives constructed by historians. As a result, postmodernists regard historical writing as a form of creative composition, revealing more about the author's political, social, and personal biases than about historical reality. W.H. Walsh, a philosopher at Oxford University, identified 4 specific domains in which subjectivity can distort the historical enterprise. Personal preferences that cause a writer to favor certain outcomes or figures, biases rooted in the historian's social group or class, divergent understandings of what constitutes a valid cause or effect, and philosophical presuppositions derived from the historian's overarching worldview, which determine the plausibility of certain events such as miracles. For radical postmodernists, these four layers of subjectivity constitute an insurmountable barrier, relegating historiography to complete relativism and rendering historical certainty unattainable. The critical realist vindication, internal inconsistencies, and methodological integrity. Despite the assertive rhetoric of historical postmodernism, most contemporary historians have rejected its radical skepticism and continue to uphold historical realism. Historiographer Ernst Breisach observes that over the past 4 centuries, scholars have systematically developed, tested, and refined historical methodologies. This multidisciplinary toolkit, which includes textual criticism, archaeology, and source analysis, provides a robust defense against fabrication, distortion, and error, and has proven to be a reliable means of discerning historical truth. Subjectivity does not render historiography futile. Rather, as Walsh and others argue, the influence of human bias can be identified, measured, and systematically mitigated through rigorous methodology. Critical realists have also demonstrated that radical historical postmodernism is inherently self-refuting. Philosophers and historians such as Richard Evans, Brian Fay, Perez Zagorin, and Michael Licona have noted that postmodern critics frequently employ the very historical and linguistic tools they claim are invalid. For example, postmodern author Elisabeth Ermarth acknowledges that her critiques are composed in standard realist language, yet she maintains that this does not undermine her challenge to historical hegemony. Perez Zagorin observes that postmodernists often produce detailed histories of intellectual movements, presuming the truth and factual consistency of their own narratives. Brian Fay encapsulates this contradiction by stating that most post-metaphysical meta-theories implode because they utilize what they deny is legitimate. Historian John Tosh further argues that postmodernism itself is situated within a specific historical context. Absent a foundation in actual historical reality, postmodern critiques become arbitrary impositions by the critic upon the text. It is important to acknowledge that more nuanced postmodernists often anticipate the charge of self-refutation and attempt to address it. Some maintain that their project is primarily therapeutic, aiming to destabilize ideological narratives without constructing an alternative historiographical framework. Others contend that their use of realist language or historiographical tools is a pragmatic adaptation to communicative conventions rather than an endorsement of epistemological realism. Still others assert that their critiques function at the level of meta-language, seeking to reveal the power structures underlying historical discourse rather than denying the necessity of narrative coherence. Recognizing these nuanced responses ensures a balanced critique, while also highlighting that such replies rely on historically situated arguments and presuppose a certain level of communicative confidence, thereby exposing the persistent tension within radical postmodern skepticism. Michael Licona categorizes contemporary historical scholarship into 3 principal approaches. First, naive realism, which accepts historical events based on methodological and superficial source confirmation without substantial critical or epistemological engagement. Second, postmodernism, characterized by radical skepticism that regards all historical narratives as subjective constructs, a stance adopted by only a small minority of scholars. And third, critical realism, which values and rigorously analyzes historical evidence, holding conclusions with varying degrees of probability and fully acknowledging human subjectivity while maintaining that knowable historical data can be recovered. Licona concludes that critical realism represents the predominant perspective among historians. Philosopher of history C. Behan McCullough supports this position by emphasizing that, although absolute mathematical certainty about the past is unattainable, objective criteria such as explanatory power and scope enable the evaluation of historical reports. Skepticism is warranted toward descriptions lacking evidential support, but it is intellectually justified to accept as true those accounts that are well substantiated. The canonical matrix, promise plan theology and the necessity of ontological history. The philosophical defense of historical realism finds its perfect systemic parallel in biblical theology. While systematic theology often imposes post-biblical philosophical categories onto the text, biblical theology seeks to let the Bible speak from within its own organic, historical, and literary framework. Central to this organic unity is Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s concept of promise plan theology. Kaiser argues that the entire canon of Scripture is bound together by a single, progressive, and unfolding divine promise, God's pledge to be present with His people and to bless the nations through the seed of Abraham, a promise that finds its ultimate climactic fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Critical realism's approach of assigning varying degrees of probability to historical claims, while maintaining that well-supported data can be recovered, provides the epistemological framework necessary to evaluate the historical claims of the promise plan without resorting to naive credulity or radical skepticism. The promise plan does not demand mathematical certainty, but it does require that the redemptive events it describes occurred in space and time. Otherwise, the divine promises lose their referential significance, and the organic development of God's purposes devolves into myth or subjective interpretation. However, it is important to note that other biblical theological models address the issue of historical realism differently. Narrative theology, for instance, often emphasizes the form, function, and impact of the biblical narrative within the faith community, sometimes prioritizing the formation of Christian identity and meaning over the verification of each event as a space-time historical event. Similarly, canonical criticism, as developed by Brevard Childs, focuses on the final form of the biblical canon as the primary context for theological reflection, emphasizing the unity and theological message of the completed scriptures. While these models do not necessarily deny the importance of a historical foundation, they may be more open to exploring theological or literary interpretations of biblical events when historical certainty is elusive. In contrast, the Promise Plan framework places greater emphasis on the ontological reality of redemptive events and closely aligns with the critical realist conviction that history is indispensable to understanding God's redemptive purposes. The Promise Plan of God is fundamentally connected to linear ontological history. In contrast to the cyclical mythologies of the ancient Near East or the abstract, timeless concepts of Greek Gnosticism, the Hebraic worldview regards history as the unique setting for divine action and revelation. Events such as the call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, the Exodus from Egypt in Exodus chapter 14, the establishment of the Davidic Covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and the Babylonian exile are not merely metaphors or subjective narratives devised by later communities. Rather, they are concrete occurrences within space and time. If these events did not transpire in linear history, the entire Promise Plan would be undermined, as a fictional promise cannot affect genuine redemption. The biblical concept of truth, denoted by the Hebrew term emet, signifies stability, reliability, and factual reality. It refers to that which endures critical examination. This Hebraic emphasis on historical facticity sharply contrasts with the postmodern perspective that regards history as a mere linguistic construct. The New Testament authors proclaim the gospel within this realistic historical context. For instance, the Apostle Paul's argument for the resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is grounded in a critical realist epistemology. If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. Paul does not present a subjective, postmodern meta-narrative of spiritual renewal. Instead, he bases the validity of the Christian faith on a specific, verifiable event in space and time. This historical necessity becomes even more apparent when considered in the context of Second Temple Judaism and the Old Testament's supernatural worldview. Texts such as Deuteronomy chapter 32 verses 8 through 9 and Psalm 82 depict the cosmic structure of the ancient world. Yahweh disinherited rebellious nations, assigning them to lesser divine beings, the sons of God, while selecting Israel as His own inheritance. Within this paradigm, the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus constitute a deliberate cosmic initiative by Yahweh to reclaim the nations from hostile spiritual powers. For this reclamation to be effective, it had to occur openly within human history. A purely subjective or mystical experience confined to the disciples would lack the objective authority to alter cosmic realities or defeat spiritual principalities. The triumph over these powers necessitated a physical, public vindication of Yahweh's Messiah. Consequently, biblical theology requires a historical realism that parallels the historiographical realism advocated by secular critical realists. The Minimal Facts Method, a realist framework for historical apologetics. To bridge the gap between historical realism and the ancient texts of the New Testament, Gary R. Habermas developed the Minimal Facts Method, a critical realist tool designed to operate effectively even in an environment saturated with postmodern skepticism. For 5 decades, Habermas has maintained that there is a significant body of historical data regarding the end of Jesus' life that is virtually unanimously recognized by specialists from almost every religious and philosophical persuasion. To designate an occurrence as a minimal fact, the data must satisfy 2 rigorous conservative prerequisites. First, the event must be established by abundant, strong evidence, typically through multiple independently ascertained critical lines of historical argumentation. Second, the vast majority of contemporary scholars with credentials in relevant fields, including atheists, agnostics, liberals, and conservatives, who have published must explicitly acknowledge the historicity of the event. The method proceeds by assembling these independent lines of evidence from the earliest sources, submitting each proposed fact to the judgment of the scholarly guild across ideological lines, and thereby constructing a core of data that bypasses prior worldview commitments. It is important to recognize several potential criticisms and limitations of the minimal facts method. Some critics contend that selection bias may affect which facts are designated as minimal, as the criteria for sufficient establishment or widespread agreement are not always clearly defined. Others highlight the difficulty of determining genuine scholarly consensus, noting that academic agreement may result from dominant paradigms, sociological influences, or limited access to dissenting views, rather than from a purely objective evaluation of the evidence. Additionally, questions may arise regarding whether the pool of recognized experts accurately represents the entire field or whether certain perspectives are marginalized. Addressing these concerns enhances the credibility of the minimal facts method by encouraging careful scrutiny of fact selection and the definition of consensus, thereby promoting greater transparency and methodological rigor. The primary strength of the minimal facts method lies in its methodological neutrality. It does not assume the divine inspiration or overall reliability of the New Testament. Instead, it treats the Gospels as ancient historical documents subject to critical scrutiny. By maintaining these standards, the method addresses the 4 sources of subjectivity identified by Walsh, compelling scholars of all perspectives to engage directly with the historical evidence. This approach prevents the dismissal of evidence based on prior naturalistic assumptions or broad postmodern skepticism. Even prominent critics of Christianity, such as Bart Ehrman, acknowledge that the post-crucifixion experiences of the disciples are established within the historical record. When Habermas applies the minimal facts criterion to the end of Jesus' life, a substantial, highly secure historical core emerges, recognized by friends and foes alike. Number 1, the death of Jesus by crucifixion. The first and most firmly established minimal fact is that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. This event is attested by an overwhelming array of early, independent Christian and non-Christian sources, and its historical reality is supported by precise medical insights into Roman execution. The consensus on this fact is total. Skeptical academic John Dominic Crossan famously declares that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Marcus Borg agrees, calling Jesus' execution the most certain fact about the historical Jesus, while German critic Gerd Ludemann asserts flatly that the fact of Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Number 2, the disciples' experiences of post-crucifixion appearances. The second minimal fact is that shortly after Jesus' death, his disciples had real experiences that absolutely convinced them that the risen Jesus had appeared to them, both individually and in groups. This is not a late Christian myth. Bart Ehrman has acknowledged that the disciples' post-crucifixion experiences are part of the historical record. The primary catalyst for this scholarly consensus is the testimony of the Apostle Paul. Critical scholars take Paul's evidence with utmost seriousness because his letters provide an exceptionally early, first-person eyewitness account of what he firmly believed was a literal resurrection appearance. Furthermore, Paul was a highly trained intellectual who personally knew the primary Jerusalem apostles, including Peter, John, and James, the brother of Jesus, in Galatians chapter 1. Number 3, the transformation of the disciples and key skeptics. The historical core expands further when evaluating the radical, sudden transformations of the early Christian leaders. Following the crucifixion, the disciples were completely disillusioned, dispirited, and gripped by fear. Yet within weeks, they were transformed into bold proclaimers of the resurrection, willingly facing persecution, social ostracization, and brutal martyrdom for their message. This transformation is also observed in key skeptics who were hostile to the movement. James, the brother of Jesus, who was an unbeliever during Jesus' earthly ministry, and Paul, a violent persecutor of the early church. Both were converted after personal experiences they genuinely believed were physical appearances of the risen Christ. Number 4, the early proclamation and creedal traditions. Postmodern critics often argue that historical accounts degrade over long-time gaps between the event and its recording. However, critical realism dismantles this objection by uncovering pre-Pauline creedal traditions embedded within the New Testament epistles. Textual formulas such as 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 3 through 7, Luke chapter 24 verse 34, and Romans chapter 1 verses 3 through 4 are recognized by a consensus of critical scholars as standardized oral creeds that date back to within 1 to 2 years, if not months, of the crucifixion, originating directly within the eyewitness apostolic community in Jerusalem. As New Testament scholar Geza Vermes notes, after scrutinizing various naturalistic hypotheses, none of the traditional skeptical alternative theories stand up to strict historical scrutiny. Ancient historian Paul Maier further reinforces this realist core by demonstrating that the early public proclamation of the resurrection in Jerusalem would have been impossible if Jesus' tomb had remained occupied. Anyone wishing to crush the nascent Christian movement could have driven a wooden stake through its heart simply by producing the dead body of Jesus. The total absence of any ancient record claiming the tomb still contained Jesus' body has led a rapidly growing number of critical researchers to accept the historical reality of the empty tomb. Conclusion: historical postmodernism attempts to restrict historical inquiry to present subjectivity, contending that the past is inaccessible due to pervasive bias and linguistic instability. However, philosophical and methodological analysis demonstrates that such radical skepticism is internally inconsistent. The dominant perspective among contemporary historians continues to endorse critical realism as the most reliable approach to historiographical research, indicating that the disciplined application of historical criteria can yield a recoverable historical core. Nonetheless, historiographical pluralism persists, with some scholars advocating for narrative epistemology, constructionism, or pragmatic historiography, thereby questioning the feasibility or value of objective reconstruction. These alternative perspectives are more prominent in theoretical discourse than in practical historical research. By engaging with these approaches and explaining the sustained prominence of critical realism, this essay seeks to present a balanced and accurate account of current debates in the field. Historical realism is essential for biblical theology. Within Walter Kaiser's Promise Plan framework, God's redemptive purpose is realized through the linear progression of space-time history. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is presented not as a subjective experience or literary construct, but as a concrete event central to God's reclamation of creation. Critical realism offers the epistemological foundation necessary to affirm that the events underlying the Promise Plan including the bodily resurrection, occurred in actual history rather than in myth or collective imagination. By employing Gary Habermas's Minimal Facts Method, the critical realist historian can identify a widely recognized historical core concerning the crucifixion, the early creedal traditions, and the transformative experiences of the disciples. This data forms a stable foundation, allowing for a careful and textually grounded movement from the historical facts of the disciples' experiences to the ontological reality of the risen Christ. For biblical theology, this alignment means that the promise plan can be traced as a genuinely historical sequence. The concrete events of Israel's history and the resurrection remain essential for Gentile inclusion and the restoration of sacred space. Apologetics grounded in this approach can address academic skepticism without relinquishing the particularities central to Christian faith. The Church, therefore, is assured that its proclamation is anchored in events that withstand critical historical scrutiny. The methodological partnership between critical realism and promise plan theology preserves both the intellectual integrity of Christian witness and the organic unity of Scripture's redemptive narrative from Genesis to the new creation.